I agree with Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul on their opposition to the sanctions that were overwhelmingly passed 98-2 today in the Senate, sanctions against Russia and sanctions against Iran. The U.S. Senate voted nearly unanimously today for legislation to impose new sanctions on Russia and Iran. It would also force President Trump to get Congress's approval before easing any of those sanctions. So it was a 98-2 vote. And as I already mentioned, it was Rand Paul and Bernie Sanders who were the only two no votes. Rand Paul, a Republican, Bernie Sanders, of course, something of a Democrat. The measure intended to push, according to Reuters, the measure intended to push Russia punish Russia for interfering in the 2016 election, for its annexation of Ukraine's Crimea region and for support of Syria's government. So if the House of Representatives passes this and signs it into law it's signed into law by Trump, it would put the sanctions previously established by President Obama, including some of the Russian energy projects. Here is the backlash that came to Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul, but particularly to Bernie Sanders. The backlash that he received was to be expected. The backlash that he received was, now we know that Bernie Sanders is a Russian stooge because he voted against sanctions, on Russia. And somehow this underscores in the minds of people who have fully committed themselves to the Russia narrative, this underscores or solves the problem for them. It's almost like this makes sense to them now and they can understand the world better because it's clear that Bernie Sanders was there all along simply as a tool of the Russian government. This is legitimately things that are being parroted by people who believe this narrative. Here's what Bernie Sanders said about it. Bernie Sanders slammed it, and he said that this legislation, if signed, these sanctions ultimately would undermine the Iranian nuclear deal. And so it's not that he's opposed to sanctioning Russia. He's opposed to the fact that these sanctions have been combined with additional sanctions on Iran, and that those sanctions on Iran stand a chance of undermining the nuclear deal. Then it makes absolutely no sense for us to destabilize a highly volatile situation in the Middle East in exchange for punishing Russia. And that makes absolute sense to me. If we have gone through the process of stopping Iran, getting them to agree to halt their nuclear program, which was one of the most destabilizing forces in the region, or the possibility in the region. If we were able to negotiate a deal to have them halt their program, why would we now go back and undermine it simply for the sake of punishing not only Iran, but punishing Russia? This was the rationale of Bernie Sanders. And he said, quote, "That is not a risk worth taking, particularly at a time of heightened tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia and its allies." He said, quote, "I think that the United States should play a more even-handed role in the Middle East and find ways not only to address Iran's activity, but also Saudi Arabia's decades-long support of radical extremism." Similarly, Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, he questioned the legislation on Wednesday, and we discussed that briefly yesterday, but he wanted to urge Congress to ensure that any sanctions package would, quote, "allow the president to have flexibility to adjust sanctions to meet the needs of what is the evolving diplomatic situation." And so this in an attempt, and this goes lockstep with the Democratic Party's desire to punish Russia. And to further the Russia narrative, it fits perfectly within that worldview, but the price of it, the cost of it, is potentially destabilizing the nuclear agreement that we have with Iran, that although not perfect, it clearly stabilized a volatile situation for the next few years. And here we are, in order to punish Russia, we are looking to punish Iran. It's a 2-for-1 deal. Now, in reality, the reason you have both of these together is because of negotiations, Because if you were going to get Republicans to sign on to this, then you had to give them something. The Republicans weren't going to just sign on to this simply to punish Russia. There are a lot of Republicans who have been going after the Iranian nuclear deal since it was signed. And so for them, this was worthwhile. Yes, we'll give you the additional sanctions against Russia. You give us some additional sanctions against Iran, and everybody's happy. Everybody's happy except the two senators, one in particular, Bernie Sanders, who has enough wisdom to say that this is not worth destabilizing an already volatile region and situation. And the fact that he's by himself on this, with Rand Paul, it doesn't speak to anything in terms of right. We're not going to take an appeal to the majority, an appeal to the masses as a means of justifying and say this must be right because 98 people voted for it. No. If I'm Bernie Sanders, there was one, and it escapes me, the one congresswoman who voted against the Iraq war, and Bernie Sanders had enough foresight to see what was going to happen. So it's not always the case that we can just turn around and say, oh, simply because we have the majority of people voting for this, that these two guys have to be wrong. Every now and then, when you know something is wrong, you have to be able to stand alone. And Bernie Sanders was willing to stand alone with this vote on the Iran-Russia sanctions. He and Senator Rand Paul, who is a Republican.